Story 1. The Vanishing Highway. Marcus Chen had been driving the Trans-Canada Highway for 17 years, hauling freight between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg through some of the most isolated stretches of road in Ontario. At 42 years old, he'd seen everything the northern routes had to offer. Whiteout blizzards that turned the world into a wall of static black ice that could flip a rig in seconds, and fog banks so thick his headlights barely penetrated 3 feet ahead. He'd driven through all of it with the calm confidence of someone who'd logged over 2 million miles without a single accident. His Kenworth T680 was his second home, equipped with every modern convenience. GPS navigation, satellite radio, a CB radio that crackled with the voices of other drivers fighting the same lonely roads, and a small refrigerator stocked with energy drinks and sandwiches his wife prepared every Sunday night. It was October 14, 2019, just past 2 in the morning when Marcus merged onto Highway 11 heading north from Thunder Bay. The temperature had dropped to -5°C and a light snow had begun to fall, the kind that looked beautiful in his headlights but turned the asphalt into a skating rink if you weren't careful. He'd made this run hundreds of times, knew every curve and grade by heart. The highway stretched ahead of him in a ribbon of black, flanked on both sides by dense boreal forest that pressed close to the road like walls of a canyon. His cargo was standard, automotive parts destined for a manufacturing plant in Kapuska Singh. Nothing unusual, nothing that required special handling. He settled into his seat, adjusted the heat, and let the steady hum of the diesel engine lull him into that meditative state all long-haul truckers know, where the miles pass without conscious thought, but every sense remains alert. The first sign that something was wrong came at 2:47 a.m. Marcus glanced at his GPS and frowned. According to the display, he should have passed the turnoff for Nipigon 20 minutes ago, but he hadn't seen any signs. He wasn't particularly worried. GPS systems glitched sometimes, especially this far north where satellite coverage could be spotty. He reached for his CB radio and keyed the mic. "This is Big Thunder rolling north on Highway 11. Anybody out there got eyes on Nipigon?" "I think I might have missed my marker." Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting the channel, but got nothing except the empty hiss of dead air. That was unusual but not unprecedented. He checked his cell phone. No signal. That was normal for this stretch. He drove on, watching for familiar landmarks. There should have been a gas station coming up, a lonely Shell station that stayed open 24 hours to serve the truckers and the handful of locals who lived in the scattered communities along the route. He'd stopped there countless times, knew the night clerk by name, a Cree woman named Sarah who always had fresh coffee brewing and liked to talk about her grandchildren. But the expected lights never appeared. The highway continued straight and empty, the snow falling steadily now, accumulating on the shoulders but not yet sticking to the road surface. Marcus checked his odometer. He'd traveled 63 kilometers since leaving Thunder Bay, which meant he should definitely be approaching Nipigon. The forest on both sides seemed to have grown denser, the trees pressing even closer, their branches creating a canopy overhead that blocked out what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. At 3:15 a.m., Marcus noticed something that made his stomach tighten. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. That was impossible. He'd filled up before leaving Thunder Bay, and after 60-plus kilometers of driving with a heavy load, he should have burned through at least 1/8 of a tank. He tapped the gauge, wondering if it was stuck, but the needle didn't move. His mind raced through explanations. Faulty gauge, though it had been working fine earlier. Some kind of instrument panel malfunction, though everything else seemed normal. He tried the CB radio again, cycling through all the channels, and was met with the same suffocating static. His GPS had frozen, still showing his last known position near Thunder Bay, the blue dot of his location spinning uselessly in place. The temperature inside the cab began to drop despite the heater running at full blast. Marcus could see his breath misting in the air. He cranked the heat higher, but the chill deepened, seeping into his bones. The snow outside had intensified, not falling now, but swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, forming shapes in his headlight beams that looked disturbingly like grasping hands or twisted faces. He shook his head, blaming fatigue and the isolation, but the images persisted. The highway ahead remained unchanging, the same endless black strip flanked by the same oppressive forest. No signs, no markers, no other vehicles, no lights in the distance. Just the road and the trees and the falling snow. At 4 a.m., Marcus realized he should have traveled over 120 kilometers from Thunder Bay. At his steady speed of 90 kilometers per hour, the math was simple. But his GPS still showed him near Thunder Bay, and his odometer, when he checked it against his trip meter, seemed to have stopped advancing. The numbers were frozen. He pulled over to the shoulder, put the truck in park, and sat there trying to understand what was happening. The logical part of his brain insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Some combination of equipment failure and disorientation, maybe carbon monoxide poisoning affecting his judgment. But the deeper, more primitive part of his mind was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the world outside his windshield. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of the cab, intending to check the truck, maybe walk around and clear his head. The cold hit him like a physical blow, far colder than -5 should feel. His breath came out in great plumes of vapor that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence was absolute and oppressive. No wind, no animal sounds, no distant traffic noise. Just silence so complete it felt like pressure against his eardrums. He walked to the front of the truck and examined the hood, the tires, found everything normal. When he looked up at the forest, he saw that the trees were completely still, not a branch moving despite the cold that should have carried some breeze. That's when he noticed the road behind him. Where there should have been the tracks of his tires in the snow on the shoulder, there was nothing. The snow was pristine, undisturbed, as if he'd simply materialized in this spot. Marcus felt his heart begin to hammer. He walked back along the shoulder, following where he knew his truck had traveled. But there were no tire marks, no evidence that any vehicle had passed this way. The asphalt itself looked wrong, too perfect, too unmarked. Highways this far north bore the scars of harsh winters. Potholes, patches, cracks. This road was flawless, like it had just been paved, the lines painted bright and fresh. He climbed back into the cab, his hands shaking now, and put the truck in gear. He had to keep moving, had to find something familiar, some sign of civilization. The highway stretched ahead and he followed it, watching his speedometer climb to 90, then 100, then 110 kilometers per hour, faster than he should drive in these conditions, but driven by a growing panic he couldn't suppress. The forest blurred past, and still, nothing changed. No intersections, no side roads, no buildings, no signs. The fuel gauge hadn't moved. The odometer remained frozen. His GPS showed the same error message, and the CB radio produced only that endless static. At 5:30 a.m., when the sky should have been showing the first hints of dawn, the darkness remained absolute. Marcus realized that the sun wasn't coming. He'd been driving for over 3 hours into what should have been sunrise, but the night persisted, unchanging and eternal. The temperature in the cab had dropped so low he could see frost forming on the inside of the windows despite the heater roaring. His fingers were numb on the steering wheel, and when he breathed, the moisture in his breath crackled as it froze. Then he saw the lights. Far ahead, a faint glow that resolved into what looked like the illuminated signs of a truck stop. Relief flooded through him, so intense it made him dizzy. He pressed the accelerator, urging the truck faster, desperate to reach that promise of humanity and warmth. As he got closer, he could make out more details. A parking lot with several trucks, the familiar orange glow of sodium vapor lights, the neon signs of a restaurant. He pulled into the lot and parked, his hands trembling so badly he could barely turn off the ignition. The other trucks in the lot were old models, designs from the 1980s and early 1990s, their paint faded and their chrome dulled. Marcus barely registered this detail, too focused on getting inside, on finding help and answers. He climbed down from the cab and walked toward the restaurant entrance, his boots crunching on gravel that shouldn't have been gravel, should have been asphalt. The door was heavy, the kind with a pneumatic closer, and when he pushed it open, a bell chimed. Inside, the restaurant was frozen in time. The decor was decades out of date. Vinyl booths in avocado green, wood paneling on the walls, a jukebox in the corner playing a song Marcus didn't recognize. Something with too many instruments, discordant and unsettling. There were people in the booths, truckers by the look of them, wearing clothes that seemed slightly wrong, styles that were almost contemporary but not quite. They turned to look at him as he entered, and Marcus felt his breath catch. Their faces were normal, unremarkable, but their eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises, just solid black orbs that reflected the fluorescent lights like polished stone. He backed toward the door, but it had closed behind him, and when he reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. The truckers stood as one, moving with perfect synchronization, and began walking toward him. They didn't speak, made no sound except the shuffle of their feet on the linoleum floor. Marcus shouted, hammered on the door, felt panic surge into full-blown terror. The nearest trucker reached out a hand, and Marcus saw that his fingers were too long, the joints bending in too many places, and his skin had a waxy, translucent quality that showed the dark shapes of things moving beneath. The door suddenly gave way, and Marcus fell backward onto the gravel, scrambled to his feet, and ran for his truck. He didn't look back, couldn't afford to look back, just focused on reaching the cab and getting away from this place. He threw himself into the driver's seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. He threw the transmission into gear and stomped the accelerator, the truck lurching forward, tires spinning on the gravel before finding traction. In his mirrors, he could see the figure standing in front of the restaurant, perfectly still, watching him leave with those terrible black eyes. He drove. The highway opened before him, and he followed it with no thought except escape. The frozen landscape blurred past, and time lost all meaning. He might have driven for hours or days. There was no way to tell in that endless darkness where the sun never came and the road never changed. His mind felt stretched thin, reality and nightmare blending together until he couldn't distinguish between them. He saw things in the forest, shapes that walked on too many legs or none at all, faces that pressed against the trees as if the bark was thin membrane they were trying to push through. He saw other vehicles, ancient trucks and cars that paced him, their drivers visible through the windows, all with those same empty black eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Marcus crested a hill, and the sky ahead was gray with genuine dawn light. The highway beneath his tires felt different, rougher, real. His GPS suddenly beeped and showed his position. Highway 11 approaching Nipigon. His CB radio crackled to life with a trucker's voice complaining about the weather. His fuel gauge showed just under 3/4 full, exactly where it had been when the nightmare started, but his odometer showed he'd traveled 387 kilometers. His trip meter indicated he'd been driving for 4 hours and 12 minutes. The sun was rising, and when he checked the dashboard clock, it showed 6:47 a.m., October 14th, 2019. Marcus pulled into the Shell station in Nipigon, the one where Sarah worked, and sat in the parking lot shaking. When he finally went inside, Sarah greeted him normally, asked if he wanted his usual coffee. He asked her what day it was, what time it was, needed to hear her confirm what his instruments were telling him. She looked at him strangely, but answered, "Monday morning, just before 7. She asked if he was feeling all right, said he looked pale. He told her he was fine, just tired, bought his coffee, and went back to his truck. He completed his delivery to Kapuskasing without incident, then turned around and drove back to Thunder Bay. He told his dispatcher he was taking a week off, told his wife he needed some rest. He never told anyone what had happened on that highway, knew they wouldn't believe him, wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. But he also never drove Highway 11 at night again, always planned his routes to arrive before sunset and stop if darkness caught him. He sold the Kenworth 6 months later, bought a newer model, as if changing trucks could somehow protect him from whatever he'd encountered. Sometimes late at night, Marcus lies awake and thinks about that impossible stretch of highway, about the restaurant with its black-eyed inhabitants, about the road that went nowhere and everywhere. He wonders if he actually escaped or if he's still there driving through that endless darkness and everything since has been some kind of dream. His mind constructed to cope with a horror it couldn't process. He checks his GPS obsessively now, marks his position every few minutes when he drives, needs the constant confirmation that he's moving through real space and real time. And sometimes, when he's driving through remote areas at dusk, he sees highways that branch off from the main road, exits that aren't on any map, and he feels the pull of them, the invitation to turn onto them and see where they lead. But he never does. He learned his lesson. Some roads don't take you anywhere you can come back from, and some stretches of highway exist outside the normal rules of space and time, traps for the unwary traveler who ventures into them when the world grows dark and strange. Story 2. The Broadcast. Allison Ward had been a radio broadcaster for 23 years, working the night shift at CKNW, a small AM station in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. At 51, she had the kind of smooth, warm voice that made late-night listeners feel less alone during the long Arctic darkness. Her show, Midnight North, ran from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. 6 nights a week, playing a mix of classic rock, country, and taking call-ins from insomniacs, shift workers, and lonely souls scattered across thousands of square kilometers of tundra and taiga. She knew many of her regular callers by voice. Robert, a security guard at the diamond mine who always requested Johnny Cash. Margaret, an elderly widow in Bachoco who liked to talk about her late husband. James, a park ranger stationed in a remote cabin who called just to hear another human voice during the isolation of winter patrols. The station itself was located in a squat concrete building on the outskirts of Yellowknife, surrounded by scrub pine and bare rock with a transmission tower rising 200 feet into the sky. Allison worked alone during her shift, the building empty except for her presence in the broadcast booth. She'd never minded the solitude, found it peaceful, actually. The quiet hum of equipment and the knowledge that her voice was reaching out across the darkness to thousands of listeners. The booth was small but comfortable, equipped with a professional mixing board, 3 computer monitors showing playlists and news feeds, and a wall of windows that looked out over the parking lot and the forest beyond. A single halogen security light illuminated the area immediately around the building, but beyond that perimeter, the darkness was absolute during the winter months when the sun barely crept above the horizon. It was January 22, 2021, deep in the heart of winter when Yellowknife experienced only 4 hours of dim twilight before the darkness returned. The temperature outside was minus 38 Celsius before wind chill, the kind of cold that turned exposed skin white with frostbite in minutes. Allison had arrived at 10:30 p.m. as usual, checked the equipment, queued up her first playlist, and settled in with her thermos of tea and the paperback novel she was reading between segments. The show started normally, her opening greeting familiar and comfortable. "Good evening, Midnight North. This is Allison Ward keeping you company through the longest hours. It's -38 out there, so stay warm, stay safe, and let's share some music to chase away the darkness. The first 2 hours passed without incident. She played requests, read weather updates, shared a few local news items. At 1:15 a.m. during a commercial break, the phone lines lit up with an incoming call. She clicked the button to connect. CKNW, you're on Midnight North. Static greeted her, thick and crackling, the kind of interference that sometimes happened when someone called from very far away or during atmospheric conditions that disrupted signals. "Hello, can you hear me?" she asked. The static continued for a few seconds, then resolved into what sounded like breathing, slow and deliberate, but with a strange quality to it, almost mechanical. "Hello?" Allison tried again, her finger hovering over the disconnect button. Then a voice came through, distorted and hollow, speaking words she couldn't quite understand, syllables that didn't form any language she recognized. It sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison, layered over each other with slightly different timing, creating a disorienting echo effect. She disconnected the call, attributed it to some kind of technical glitch or prank caller with a voice modulator, and queued up the next song. But as she did, all three of her computer monitors flickered, the screens going black for a fraction of a second before returning to normal. At 1:47 a.m., the phone rang again. This time when she answered, the voice was clearer and it was speaking English, but the words made her skin prickle. "You shouldn't be alone there, Allison. Not tonight. Not when they're so close." It was a woman's voice, middle-aged and terrifyingly familiar, though Allison couldn't immediately place it. "Who is this?" she demanded. "You know who this is," the voice replied. "You've known for years. Check the parking lot, Allison. Look out your window." The line went dead. Allison stood slowly and walked to the window, her heart beating faster than it should. The parking lot was empty except for her silver Honda Civic, parked directly under the security light where she always left it. Nothing else moved in the pool of illumination. The forest beyond was a wall of black, impenetrable. She was about to turn away when something caught her attention. There were footprints in the snow leading from the tree line toward the building. Human footprints from the size and shape. But wrong somehow. They were too far apart, as if whoever made them had been taking strides of 8 or 9 feet, and they led right up to the building's side door, the entrance she'd used when she arrived. Her car's tracks were clearly visible, but there had been no other vehicle, no explanation for how someone could have walked here from the forest in -38-degree weather. She checked the building's security system, pulling up the camera feeds on one of her monitors. 4 cameras covered the exterior, and she cycled through them. Nothing. The parking lot was empty, the side door closed, the area around the transmission tower clear. But when she rewound the footage to half an hour ago, she saw something that made her blood freeze. A figure appeared at the edge of the tree line at 1:23 a.m., materializing from the darkness as if stepping through a curtain. It was human-shaped but moved wrong, its gait jerky and unnatural like stop-motion animation. It crossed the parking lot in those impossible strides, approached the side door, and then the camera feed distorted, becoming a mass of static and corrupted pixels. When the image cleared 5 seconds later, the figure was gone. Allison backed away from the monitors, her rational mind struggling to process what she'd seen. A technical glitch had to be. Something wrong with the camera system, maybe condensation on the lens from the extreme cold, or interference from the transmission tower. But the footprints were real. She'd seen them with her own eyes in that phone call, that voice that had known her name. She returned to the window, pressed her face close to the glass, and looked down at the side door entrance below. The footprints were still there, but now she could see that they didn't end at the door. They continued right through it, or rather they appeared on both sides of it, as if whatever made them had walked through the solid metal door without opening it. At 2:03 a.m., the station's automation system failed. Her computer monitors all displayed error messages simultaneously, and the music cut out, replaced by dead air. Allison frantically tried to reboot the systems, but nothing responded. The silence stretched, filling the broadcast booth and radiating out to all her listeners. Then through the speakers she heard something that shouldn't have been possible. Footsteps. They were coming through the station's audio feed, slow and measured, the sound of boots on a hard floor walking down what sounded like a long corridor. "Hello?" she called out, knowing it was pointless, that what she was hearing wasn't in the building with her, but somehow in the broadcast itself. The footsteps stopped, and that voice returned, the woman's voice that had called earlier, but now it was coming through the studio speakers, bypassing the phone system entirely. "We tried to warn you, Allison. We tried for weeks, but you wouldn't listen. None of you listen until it's too late." Allison grabbed her cell phone, intending to call for help, but it showed no signal, which was impossible. The station had cellular boosters specifically to ensure coverage. "Who are you?" Allison demanded, her voice echoing in the booth. "What do you want?" "To show you the truth," the voice replied. "To make you understand what's really out there, beyond the light, beyond the veil you think protects you. Look at your monitors, Allison, really look." Allison turned to her screens, and what she saw made her legs go weak. The error messages had been replaced by video feeds, but not from the station's security cameras. These were showing locations she didn't recognize. A house interior dark and empty. A stretch of highway with a single car pulled over to the shoulder. A hospital room with someone lying in a bed surrounded by machines. As she watched, figures appeared in each feed, the same wrong-moving shapes she'd seen in the parking lot, approaching the car, entering the hospital room, standing in the doorway of the dark house. "What is this?" Allison whispered. "This is happening right now," the voice answered. "All across the territory, all across the north. We walk among you in the darkness, and we're getting closer. You broadcast into the night, Allison. You send your voice out into the void, and we heard it. We've always heard it. And now we're answering." The video feeds on her monitors began to distort, the images breaking apart into geometric patterns that hurt to look at, shapes that seemed to move in directions that didn't exist, creating depth where there should only be flat screens. Allison ran for the door, abandoning her post, no longer caring about the broadcast or her responsibilities. She had to get out of the building, get to her car, get away. She burst through the booth door into the hallway, and the overhead lights began to flicker, fluorescent tubes humming with a sound that rose and fell like breathing. The corridor seemed longer than it should be, stretching away from her in both directions into darkness that the failing lights couldn't penetrate. She ran toward the exit, her footsteps echoing strangely, multiplying as if others were running with her, matching her pace. The side door was ahead, the exit sign glowing red, and she hit the crash bar at full speed, expecting the blast of Arctic cold. Instead, she stumbled into the transmission tower enclosure, a chain-link fenced area that should have been outside, separate from the building. But now it was somehow interior, the tower rising up through a ceiling that shouldn't exist, the metal girders humming with electricity and something else, a resonance that she felt in her teeth and bones. Figures stood among the supports, 5 of them, human-shaped but with proportions that were slightly off, their limbs too long, their heads tilted at angles that necks shouldn't allow. They turned toward her in perfect unison. "You can't leave," they said, their voices overlapping just like the one on the phone. "You opened the door when you broadcast, when you sent your signal out into the darkness. You called to us and we came. Now you have to help us reach the others." Allison screamed, the sound raw and primal, and ran at the fence, hit it with her shoulder, and felt the chain link give way with impossible ease, tearing like paper. She fell through into the parking lot, The real parking lot, the cold hitting her like a hammer, stealing her breath. She scrambled to her feet, slipping on ice, and ran for her car. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition, but the engine started, and she threw the transmission into reverse, then drive, speeding out of the parking lot fast enough that the car fishtailed on the ice. She looked in her rearview mirror once and saw the station building receding behind her, normal and ordinary, the lights on, the transmission tower blinking its warning beacon. But standing in the parking lot, clearly visible under the security light, were the 5 figures watching her go. Allison drove straight to the RCMP station, stumbled inside, babbling about intruders and voices and impossible things. The officer on duty, Constable Martin, listened patiently, then offered to drive back to the station with her to investigate. She refused, told him she wasn't going back, wasn't ever going back. He asked if she'd been drinking, if she was on any medication, suggested maybe she should go to the hospital, get checked out. She refused that too, just sat in the RCMP station's waiting area until dawn, until the sun finally crept above the horizon and turned the world gray instead of black. When the day shift at CKNW arrived at 6 a.m., they found the station empty, the broadcast booth abandoned, dead air hissing from the transmitter. They called Allison's cell phone repeatedly until she finally answered and told them she quit, effective immediately, that she wouldn't explain, wouldn't go back to collect her personal belongings, just told them to mail her final paycheck. The station manager listened to the archived recordings from that night, trying to understand what had happened. The audio from 1:15 a.m. to 2:03 a.m. was corrupted, filled with static and what sounded like voices speaking in overlapping layers, words he couldn't quite make out but that filled him with inexplicable dread. After 2:03 a.m., there was nothing but silence until the day shift arrived. Allison left Yellowknife 3 days later, packed everything she owned into her car and drove south. Didn't stop until she reached Edmonton. She found work at a small community radio station, daytime shift only, refused to work nights. She doesn't talk about what happened, not to her new colleagues, not to the therapist she saw briefly before deciding that talking about it only made it worse. But she knows it wasn't a breakdown or hallucination or anything her rational mind can explain away. She knows that something responded to her broadcasts, something that lives in the darkness of the far north, something that heard her voice reaching out into the void and decided to reach back. Sometimes late at night she wakes from dreams of that transmission tower humming with otherworldly frequencies, of figures standing in the darkness just beyond the light, waiting. She sold her radio, won't have one in her apartment, can't stand the sound of static or the spaces between stations where signals break up and strange sounds emerge from the white noise. And on the coldest nights of winter, when the darkness presses against her windows and the world outside seems alien and hostile, she hears that voice, faint but unmistakable, calling her name, through the walls, through the distance, through the veil between what is and what should never be. She knows that whatever she encountered hasn't forgotten her, that in some way she's marked now, connected to it by the broadcasts she sent out into the Arctic night. And she knows that one day, probably when she least expects it, she'll answer a phone or turn on a radio, and that voice will be there waiting. And this time, there won't be anywhere to run. Story 3. The Ferry. David Morrison was a marine engineer, 56 years old, with 32 years of experience working on vessels ranging from fishing boats to cargo freighters. He'd spent the last decade working for BC Ferries, maintaining the engines and mechanical systems on the ships that connected Vancouver Island to the mainland. He was methodical, thorough, and completely unflappable, qualities that made him excellent at his job. His wife Elena often joked that he was more comfortable in an engine room surrounded by diesel fumes and grinding machinery than he was at social gatherings. She wasn't wrong. David understood machines, trusted their predictable behaviors, found comfort in the logical relationships between cause and effect. On March 8, 2020, David was assigned to the MV Coastal Renaissance, one of the larger vessels in the BC Ferries fleet, for what should have been a routine overnight maintenance run. The ship was scheduled for inspection and minor repairs while in dry dock at the Esquimalt facility on Vancouver Island. But first, it needed to make an empty run from Sawasan Terminal on the mainland to Swartz Bay Terminal near Victoria, traveling without passengers or cargo, just a skeleton crew of 8. The captain, 2 deck officers, 2 engineers including David, 2 deckhands, and a cook. The voyage would take approximately an hour and 45 minutes, departing at 11:30 p.m. to minimize disruption to the regular ferry schedule. The weather forecast called for clear skies and calm seas, unusual for early March when the Strait of Georgia typically experienced rough conditions. David boarded at 10:45 p.m., made his way to the engine room, and began his pre-departure checks. The Coastal Renaissance was a massive ship, capable of carrying 1,650 passengers and 370 vehicles across its 4 vehicle decks. Empty like this, it felt cavernous and strange, the passenger areas dark, the vehicle decks vacant except for shadows and the echo of footsteps on steel. The engine room was familiar territory, though, filled with the comforting smell of lubricant and metal, the massive diesel engines ready to rumble to life. They departed on schedule, the ship pulling away from the terminal and heading out into the strait. David monitored his gauges and systems, everything running smoothly, the engines purring with the steady rhythm he'd heard thousands of times. The strait was indeed calm, the water like dark glass under a clear sky filled with stars. Through the small porthole in the engine room, David could see the lights of the mainland receding, the glow of Vancouver and surrounding cities painting the clouds with amber and white. The ship's course would take them west across the strait, then north through Active Pass between Maine and Galiano Islands before turning east towards Swartz Bay. At 12:17 a.m., 32 minutes into the voyage, the radio crackled with the captain's voice calling down to the engine room. "Engineering bridge, we've got a navigational anomaly here. GPS is showing our position, but the charts don't match what we're seeing." David keyed his mic. "What kind of anomaly, Captain?" There was a pause before the captain responded, and David could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We should be approaching Active Pass, but visibility has changed. I need you to come to the bridge." David handed off monitoring duties to the junior engineer, a young man named Thomas who looked nervous at being left alone, and climbed the stairs from the engine room to the passenger decks, then up to the bridge. The walk took several minutes, the empty ship eerie in its stillness. When he reached the bridge, he found the captain, First Officer Chen, and Second Officer Williams all staring out the forward windows with expressions David had never seen on experienced mariners. Confusion edged with fear. "Look at that," Captain Anderson said, gesturing ahead. David moved to the windows and felt his breath catch. The Strait of Georgia had vanished. Instead of the familiar waters with the dark shapes of islands visible against the sky, they were traveling through fog, but fog unlike anything David had ever encountered. It was perfectly uniform, a wall of gray that started at the water's surface and extended upward as far as he could see, with a strange luminescence as if lit from within. The ship's powerful forward lights barely penetrated 15 feet into the murk. The stars were gone. The lights of the islands were gone. Everything beyond the ship's immediate vicinity had been erased. "When did this start?" David asked. "About 5 minutes ago," First Officer Chen replied. "It came up fast, impossibly fast. One moment we had clear visibility, the next we were in this. And our instruments are reading strangely. GPS shows we're on course, but radar is showing nothing. No land masses, no other vessels, just empty space in all directions." The depth sounder is reading over 2,000 meters. David frowned. The Strait of Georgia's average depth was around 370 meters, with the deepest points reaching maybe 420 meters. That's not possible, he said. The strait isn't that deep. Captain Anderson turned from the windows. I know. I've called the Coast Guard, but I'm not getting any response, just static. Same with other vessels. The radio works, we can communicate ship to ship between stations, but we can't reach anyone off the ship. I've reduced speed to 5 knots. Until we understand what we're dealing with, I'm not running blind at normal cruise speed. It was the right call, and David nodded approval. What do you need from me? Make sure the engines are running perfectly, Anderson said. I don't want any mechanical problems on top of whatever this is. And keep your radio on. If we need emergency maneuvers, I need you ready. David returned to the engine room where Thomas was waiting anxiously. What's going on? The younger man asked. David considered lying, offering some reassuring explanation, but Thomas deserved the truth. He explained about the fog and the instrument readings and watched Thomas's face pale. We're still in the strait, though, right? I mean, we have to be. It's not like we could have gone anywhere else. That's what logic says, David agreed, but his confidence was shaken. He'd spent decades at sea, crossed oceans, weathered storms that had broken other vessels. But he'd always been able to trust his understanding of where he was and how the ocean behaved. This violated that understanding. He busied himself with checks and monitoring, keeping his hands occupied while his mind raced through explanations. A weather phenomenon, some kind of localized fog bank combined with instrument failure. But that didn't explain the depth readings or the radio issues. At 1:03 a.m., the ship's engines began to vibrate in a way that sent alarm bells ringing in David's mind. It wasn't mechanical stress, wasn't anything wrong with the machinery itself, but rather a resonance, as if something external was affecting them. The vibration increased, and through the deck plates beneath his feet, David felt it spreading through the entire ship, a thrumming that climbed in frequency. Bridge, engineering, he called on the radio. Are you feeling this? Captain Anderson's voice came back tight and controlled. Affirmative. All decks reporting vibration, source unknown. We're experiencing it up here too. Then the fog began to change. Through the porthole, David watched the gray luminescence shift, patterns forming and dissolving, shapes that almost looked like they had structure before they dissolved back into formless murk. The vibration peaked, and for a moment David felt a sensation like falling, though his feet remained firmly on the deck. His stomach lurched and his inner ear screamed that he was plummeting through space, but his eyes told him nothing had changed. The sensation passed, leaving him nauseated and disoriented. Bridge, all stations. Captain Anderson's voice over the intercom now edged with something David had never heard from the veteran captain. Fear. We have a situation. All crew report to the bridge immediately. David and Thomas secured the engine room as quickly as possible and headed upward. They met the 2 deckhands, Lopez and Martinez, coming from the vehicle decks, both looking shaken. Together they climbed to the bridge and found Anderson, Chen, and Williams staring at the radar screen. The fog had cleared. That should have been good news, but the expressions on the bridge crew's faces said otherwise. David moved to the windows and understood why. They were surrounded by water. That much was the same, but the sky was wrong. It was still night, still dark, but the stars had changed. The constellations were unfamiliar, patterns David didn't recognize despite years of celestial navigation experience. And on the horizon in all directions there was nothing. No lights of cities, no islands, no landmarks. Just water extending to a horizon that seemed too far away, as if the curvature of the earth had flattened. Where are we? Martinez asked, his voice small. Captain Anderson pointed at the GPS. According to this, we're exactly where we should be in the Strait of Georgia approaching active pass. But that's clearly not where we are. He brought up the radar display on one of the monitors. Radar is showing the same empty ocean in all directions. Depth sounder is now reading 4,987 meters and continuing to increase. That's deeper than most ocean trenches, and look at this. He adjusted a dial and the compass display came up. The needle was spinning slowly, making one complete rotation every few seconds, unable to find magnetic north. David felt the reality of their situation settling over him like a physical weight. They weren't just lost. They were somewhere that shouldn't exist, where the fundamental rules about how the world worked didn't apply. "What do we do?" Thomas asked. Captain Anderson straightened, forcing calm into his voice through sheer willpower. "We maintain course and speed. We have fuel for another 20 hours at current consumption. We have supplies. Whatever happened, there has to be a reverse, a way back. We'll continue on our original heading and hope we find our way out of this the same way we got into it." It was the only plan that made sense, and everyone nodded agreement, though David could see the fear in every face. They continued through that impossible ocean for hours. The ship's chronometers said time was passing normally, but something felt wrong about it, as if seconds stretched longer than they should or compressed in random intervals. David returned to the engine room with Thomas, both of them finding comfort in the familiar routines of monitoring and maintenance. The engines ran perfectly, their steady rhythm an anchor to normalcy in the chaos. At 4:16 a.m., according to the ship's clocks, the radio crackled to life with a voice that made every person on the ship freeze. It was Captain Anderson's voice, but it was coming over the marine radio band, not the ship's internal intercom. "MV Coastal Renaissance. This is the MV Coastal Renaissance. Do you copy?" In the engine room, David and Thomas stared at the radio speaker, then at each other. Thomas grabbed the mic. "Bridge Engineering, are you broadcasting on marine frequencies?" Captain Anderson's voice came back on the intercom, confused. "Negative, Engineering. Our marine radio isn't transmitting. Why?" Before Thomas could answer, the other voice, the one that sounded exactly like Anderson but was coming from outside the ship, spoke again. "MV Coastal Renaissance, please respond. We need help. We're lost. We don't know where we are." David felt his skin crawl. He keyed his mic. "Bridge. Something is broadcasting on marine frequencies using the captain's voice. It's not coming from the ship." The bridge fell silent, and David could imagine the crew up there processing this new impossibility. Then the external voice changed, became First Officer Chen's voice. "Is anyone there? Please, we've been traveling for so long, we need to find the way back." Then it was Lopez's voice, then Martinez's, cycling through each member of the crew, each one pleading for help, for direction, for someone to guide them home. The voices overlapped, creating a chorus of desperation that rose from the radio speaker until David reached out and turned off the receiver, silencing it. "What the hell was that?" Thomas demanded, his composure finally cracking. David had no answer. The implications were too disturbing to contemplate, that they were hearing themselves from some other time or place, or that something was mimicking them, using their voices to achieve some unknown purpose. He turned the radio back on but changed the frequency, moving away from the standard marine channels. The voices followed, appearing on every frequency he tried, the same desperate pleas in the crew's own voices. At 5:49 a.m., Lopez called up from the vehicle deck 1, his voice shaking. "Bridge, you need to see this. There's something on the deck." The crew gathered at the bridge windows overlooking the forward vehicle deck and looked down at what Lopez had found. There was a vehicle parked in the center of the deck, a dark blue sedan that definitely hadn't been there during pre-departure checks. Captain Anderson sent Williams and David down to investigate, neither man happy about the assignment but accepting it as necessary. They approached the vehicle cautiously. It was an older model Honda Accord, maybe 15 years old, covered in a thin layer of dust that suggested it had been sitting unused for some time. The doors were unlocked. David opened the driver's side and looked inside while Williams checked the rear. The interior was ordinary, unremarkable except for the items scattered on the seats and floor. Personal belongings, a woman's purse, a child's stuffed toy, a map of British Columbia spread across the passenger seat with a route marked in red pen from Vancouver to Victoria. And on the dashboard, a ferry ticket stub for the Coastal Renaissance dated March 8, 2020 for the 11:30 p.m., sailing from Sawasan to Swartz Bay. "This is tonight's sailing," Williams said, his voice hoarse. "This is our sailing." David checked the purse, found a wallet with a driver's license belonging to someone named Christine Holloway, a Vancouver address, and a photo section showing pictures of a woman in her 30s with 2 young children. The license plate matched the vehicle. He took the items to the bridge, and Anderson immediately got on the radio to try to contact the BC Ferries main dispatch to report that they had found a vehicle from tonight's passenger manifest, even though the ship was supposed to be traveling empty. The radio provided only static. "This doesn't make sense," Chen said, stating the obvious. "How did this car get on board? We checked the vehicle decks during pre-departure. They were completely empty." No one had an answer. The car's presence suggested that their reality was somehow intersecting with another version of events where the ship had carried passengers. Or that time was behaving in ways that allowed impossible things to coexist. David felt his grip on rational understanding slipping further. At 6:33 a.m., when dawn should have been breaking, the darkness remained absolute. The stars, those wrong stars, continued their slow wheel across the sky. And ahead, barely visible at first but growing clearer, something appeared on the horizon. It was a light, a single point of illumination in the endless dark. Captain Anderson altered course toward it, driven by hope or desperation, needing something to break the monotony of empty ocean. As they drew closer, the light resolved into something that made David's chest tighten with fresh horror. It was a ferry, another ship identical to the Coastal Renaissance in every detail, floating dead in the water. Its lights were on, illuminating empty decks, but there was no movement, no sign of crew or operation. Captain Anderson brought their vessel alongside, maintaining a distance of about 50 meters, and they examined their twin through binoculars. The name on the hull was clearly visible, MV Coastal Renaissance. They were looking at themselves, at another version of their own ship, floating in this impossible ocean. "Is there anyone aboard?" Martinez called out through the loudspeaker, his voice echoing across the water. No response came from the other ship, just the patient glow of lights and the slight rocking of the hull in the gentle swells. Anderson made a decision that David thought was either brave or insane. "We're sending a boat over. Volunteers only." David found himself raising his hand before he'd consciously decided to do so, driven by a need to understand, to find some answer that would make sense of the nightmare they were living. They launched one of the ship's rescue boats, a small, rigid-hull inflatable, and David, Williams, and Lopez crossed the gap to the other Coastal Renaissance. They tied off at the vehicle deck access door and climbed aboard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness of the interior spaces. The ship was indeed empty, but signs of recent occupation were everywhere. Half-eaten meals in the galley, coffee still warm in mugs, equipment running, but no people. They made their way to the bridge and found it similarly abandoned, all systems operational, the ship's log open on the chart table. David read the final entry written in handwriting that he recognized as belonging to Captain Anderson, though he'd never seen the captain actually write anything. The entry was dated March 8, 2020, and read, "Hour 47 of the voyage. Fuel supplies critical. No sign of land or rescue. Crew morale collapsed. Some have chosen to leave the ship, walking out onto the water as if it were solid ground. They don't sink. They just walk until they disappear into the distance. The others are considering following. I may be the last one left soon. If anyone finds this, tell our families we tried to find our way back. We tried for so long. 47 hours, William said. We've only been gone for 7 hours. But David understood. This was a version of them that had been caught in this place far longer, that had exhausted hope and fuel and reason until the crew had abandoned the ship to walk out onto impossible water. He took the logbook, needing evidence, needing proof that what he was seeing was real. They returned to their own ship and reported what they'd found to Captain Anderson. The captain read the log entry, and David watched something break in the older man's eyes, some final hold on hope or denial. "We need to find the way out," Anderson said quietly. "Before we become them, before we've been here long enough to believe that walking into the ocean is a reasonable choice." They left the ghost ship behind and continued onward, following their original course more from habit than any belief it would lead them home. At 7:02 a.m., the sea began to glow. Luminescence spread beneath the surface, green and blue shifting in patterns that hurt to watch. Geometry that didn't conform to Euclidean space. The glow grew brighter, and the ship began to vibrate again, that same resonance David had felt hours earlier. The fog returned, rising from the water itself, swallowing the ship in its embrace. The falling sensation hit again, stronger this time, accompanied by a wrenching disorientation that made David grab the nearest support to keep from collapsing. Then it stopped. The fog cleared, and they were in the Strait of Georgia under a dawn sky with Galliano Island visible on the port side. The GPS showed their position as 2 nautical miles from Swartz Bay Terminal, exactly where they should be according to their original course and schedule, though the chronometer showed 8:47 a.m., more than 2 hours later than their scheduled arrival. Captain Anderson immediately got on the radio and was greeted by the concerned voice of the Swartz Bay harbor master, demanding to know their status and why they hadn't responded to multiple radio calls over the past hour. They limped into port, the crew exhausted and traumatized. BC Ferries officials boarded immediately, wanting explanations for the delay and radio silence. Captain Anderson showed them the logbook from the other ship, but when they examined it, the pages David had read were blank, just empty lines waiting to be filled. The Honda Accord was still on vehicle deck 1, though, physical proof of something impossible. The officials contacted Christine Holloway at the address on the license, and she answered, confused, saying she was at home in Vancouver, that she'd never taken the ferry that night, hadn't even owned that model of Honda for 3 years since trading it in. The official investigation concluded that the crew had experienced shared hallucinations due to carbon monoxide exposure from an undetected engine leak, though the mechanics who examined the ship found no evidence of any leak or elevated CO levels. The incident was buried in paperwork and classified reports. The crew signed non-disclosure agreements, and the Coastal Renaissance returned to service after a thorough inspection that found nothing wrong. The Honda was traced to a salvage yard where it had been crushed 6 months earlier, though that didn't explain how a destroyed vehicle appeared on their deck with current ferry tickets inside. David retired 2 months later, took early pension, and moved with Elena to a house in the interior, as far from the ocean as they could get while staying in British Columbia. He doesn't talk about that night, not even to Elena, who knows something terrible happened but has stopped asking for details. The other crew members scattered, some leaving maritime work entirely, others transferring to routes far from the Strait of Georgia. Captain Anderson continued working for another year before he was found dead in his apartment from what the coroner ruled a suicide, though he left no note. David knows they didn't hallucinate what happened, knows that somewhere in the space between the familiar world and whatever lies beyond it, There's an ocean that ships can slip into under the right circumstances, a place where time and distance behave differently, and the crew of the MV Coastal Renaissance still floats in their ghost ship, waiting for rescue that will never come. He knows this because sometimes late at night his cell phone rings with calls from numbers that don't exist, and when he answers he hears voices pleading for help in the darkness. Voices that sound like his own, calling from somewhere far away and long ago and eternally present, trapped in that impossible sea between one reality and another. Story 4. The Lookout. Cassandra Price had been a forest fire lookout for 11 years, stationed at various towers throughout British Columbia's interior. At 38, she'd developed the particular psychology required for the job. Comfort with extreme solitude, ability to maintain vigilance during long hours of nothing happening, and appreciation for the raw beauty of wilderness unmarred by human presence. Her current posting was Tower 14, located on a remote peak in the Caribou region, accessible only by helicopter or a grueling 8-hour hike from the nearest logging road. The tower stood 80 feet tall, a steel skeleton supporting a small cabin at the top, with wraparound windows offering 360-degree views of forested mountains stretching to every horizon. The Forest Service helicoptered in supplies every 3 weeks during fire season, which ran from May through September and otherwise left her completely alone with her radio, her books, and the endless wilderness. June 17, 2018 marked the 32nd day of Cassandra's current rotation. The fire danger rating was moderate, weather forecast called for hot and dry conditions continuing, and she'd spotted and reported 2 small fires in the past week, both successfully contained by helicopter water bombing before they could spread. The routine was familiar and comforting. Wake at dawn, scan the horizons with binoculars, mark any smoke columns on her map and report them via radio. Read during the quiet hours, scan again periodically, watch the sunset, sleep. She'd seen black bears, a lone wolf, elk herds moving through the valleys, eagles riding thermals, and once a wolverine making its solitary way across a distant ridge. The isolation didn't bother her. She'd never been someone who needed constant human contact, found the silence restorative rather than oppressive. That morning, Cassandra woke to find fog, unusual for June in the interior where mornings were typically crystal clear. The fog was thick enough that she couldn't see more than 30 feet from the tower in any direction. The forest below completely obscured, giving the impression that the tower floated in a sea of gray clouds. She made coffee, ate breakfast, and settled in to wait for the fog to burn off as the day warmed, a process that usually took a few hours. She tried her radio, the scheduled 7 a.m. check-in with the district office, but got no response, just static. That wasn't particularly concerning. Atmospheric conditions sometimes interfered with radio transmission, and they wouldn't worry unless she missed multiple check-ins. By 10 a.m., the fog hadn't thinned at all. If anything, it seemed denser, pressing against the windows of the cabin with almost physical presence. Cassandra could no longer see the tower's support structure below her, everything beyond the windows reduced to uniform gray. The temperature inside the cabin was comfortable, her propane heater working fine, but she felt a chill nonetheless. Something about the completeness of the fog triggering a primitive unease. She tried the radio again, cycling through all the emergency frequencies, and got nothing but static on every channel. At 11:23 a.m., she heard voices in the fog. They were faint, muffled by the thick air, but distinctly human, multiple people speaking, though she couldn't make out words. Cassandra went to the windows, pressed her face close to the glass, and peered into the gray. The voices continued, seeming to come from below the tower, from somewhere on the ground that should have been 120 feet beneath her perch. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the fog. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The voices stopped. Silence fell, absolute and oppressive, broken only by the slight creak of the tower swaying in a breeze Cassandra couldn't feel. Then, impossibly, there were footsteps on the tower's stairs. Heavy boots on metal ascending toward the cabin, each footfall echoing wrong, taking too long to reach her ears, as if sound itself was traveling through some medium denser than air. Cassandra's heart began to hammer. The tower's stairs were exposed, running up the outside of the support structure, and no one could have climbed them without her seeing them arrive, not with the helicopter pad at the base and no other approach except the hiking trail she would have monitored. But the footsteps were undeniable, coming closer, someone or something climbing toward her. She grabbed the nearest thing that could serve as a weapon, a heavy flashlight, and positioned herself facing the trap door that opened onto the exterior platform and stairs. The footsteps reached the top, stopped directly below the trap door. Silence stretched. Cassandra could hear her own breathing, could hear the blood rushing in her ears, but nothing else. She waited, muscles tense, ready to defend herself. A full minute passed, then another. The footsteps began again, descending now, moving back down the tower with the same too-slow echo fading into silence. Cassandra remained frozen in place for several minutes after the last sound faded, adrenaline making her hands shake. When she finally moved, she went to the windows facing the stairs and tried to see down to the platform. The fog had thinned slightly, just enough that she could make out the platform about 20 feet below the cabin. It was empty. The stairs descending from it disappeared into fog after a few steps. Whatever she'd heard, if she'd actually heard anything and not just experienced some acoustic anomaly caused by the weather, it had left no trace. She tried to rationalize it. Sound could do strange things in fog, carry from far away, reflect off moisture droplets, create illusions of proximity and direction. But she'd lived in this tower for weeks now, was familiar with its sounds and the way weather affected them, and what she'd heard hadn't been an illusion. Those were footsteps on her tower's stairs, coming up and then going back down. She kept the flashlight nearby and returned to her routine, though concentration proved difficult. At 2:17 p.m., the fog finally began to lift, thinning from the top down, the sun's heat finally evaporating the moisture. Cassandra watched with relief as visibility increased, revealing the tower's support structure, the helicopter pad at the base, the surrounding forest. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should. She scanned the area with binoculars, searching for any sign of visitors, but saw nothing except trees and brush and the dirt clearing around the tower. The fog cleared completely by 3 p.m., the day becoming bright and hot, and Cassandra tried the radio again. This time she got through, the district dispatcher's voice crackling with static but audible. "Tower 14, this is District. We've been trying to reach you all day. Are you all right?" Cassandra hesitated, considered mentioning the fog and the voices and the footsteps, but decided against it. "All fine here. Had some weird atmospheric interference this morning. Radio wouldn't transmit. It's clear now, though. No smoke sightings to report." The dispatcher acknowledged and signed off. Cassandra felt foolish for having been frightened, attributed the morning's events to isolation and an overactive imagination, and determined to put it out of her mind. She spent the afternoon reading, scanning the horizons periodically, watching the forest stretch away in all directions under brilliant sunshine. Night fell, and Cassandra went through her usual routine. Dinner, evening radio check-in, washing up, reading by lamplight. She went to bed around 10 p.m., leaving one lamp on low as she always did, and fell asleep to the familiar sounds of the tower creaking gently in the night breeze. She woke at 2:34 a.m. to complete silence. The wind had stopped, the forest utterly still, and in that silence, she heard breathing. It was coming from inside the cabin, from somewhere very close. Slow and deliberate inhalations and exhalations that definitely weren't her own. Cassandra sat up, reaching for the flashlight on the bedside table, and swept the beam around the small cabin. Empty. Just her bed, the desk with radio equipment, the small kitchenette, the door to the outside platform firmly closed. But the breathing continued, and now that she was fully awake, she could tell it was coming from right beside her bed, as if someone invisible was standing there watching her sleep. She scrambled out of bed, putting distance between herself and that sound, and grabbed the bear spray from her emergency supplies, holding it ready. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm armed. Identify yourself." The breathing stopped. Cassandra waited, the bear spray aimed at empty air, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the cabin. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. She checked the trapdoor, found it locked from the inside as she'd left it. She was alone, had to be alone because no one could have entered without her hearing it, and there was nowhere to hide in the cramped cabin. But she'd heard breathing, was absolutely certain of it, right next to her bed as if someone had been leaning over her sleeping form. She didn't go back to bed. She sat at the desk with all the lights on, the bear spray and flashlight within easy reach, and waited for dawn. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, every small sound making her jump, every creak of the tower making her heart race. When the sun finally rose at 5:42 a.m., she felt exhausted but relieved, the daylight returning a sense of normalcy. She made coffee, ate breakfast without tasting it, and did her morning scan of the horizons. Everything looked fine. No smoke columns, no signs of fire, just endless forest under a clear sky. At 7 a.m., she made a radio check-in, keeping her report routine and professional. At 8:15 a.m., she saw movement on the hiking trail. Someone was approaching the tower, moving quickly, almost running. Cassandra felt a surge of relief. Another human being out here would break the spell of whatever psychological episode she was experiencing. She grabbed her binoculars and focused on the approaching figure. It was a woman, young, maybe in her 20s, wearing hiking clothes and carrying a backpack. But something about her was wrong. Her movements were jerky, not fluid, like a puppet being manipulated, and as Cassandra watched, she realized the woman wasn't touching the ground. She was floating a few inches above the trail, her feet moving in a running motion but not making contact with the earth. Cassandra dropped the binoculars, her hands shaking. This wasn't real, couldn't be real. She looked again, hoping she'd been mistaken, but the woman was closer now, close enough that Cassandra didn't need binoculars to see her clearly. She reached the base of the tower and stopped, looking up directly at the cabin with eyes that were completely black, no whites, no irises, just solid black orbs. Then she started climbing the tower, not using the stairs, but ascending the outside of the support structure itself. Her hands and feet finding holds on the smooth steel beams that shouldn't have been climbable, moving with spider-like speed. Cassandra ran to the trapdoor and threw the bolt, securing it, then shoved the desk over it for extra weight. She grabbed the radio mic with trembling hands. "District Tower 14, I have an emergency situation. There's someone climbing the tower trying to get in. I need immediate helicopter evacuation." The dispatcher's voice came back calm and professional. "Tower 14, please confirm you're reporting an intruder?" Yes. She's climbing the outside of the tower. She's almost to the cabin. Please, you need to send help now." A sound on the roof made Cassandra look up. The woman had reached the top of the tower and was now on the roof of the cabin directly above her. Cassandra could hear her moving around up there, footsteps that shouldn't have been audible on the metal roof but were, loud and deliberate. The dispatcher was asking questions, trying to gather details, but Cassandra couldn't focus, couldn't do anything but stare at the ceiling and listen to those footsteps pacing back and forth. Then they stopped. The silence stretched. Cassandra heard scratching, metal on metal, and realized with horror that something was cutting through the roof. A circular section of the ceiling sagged inward, then fell, landing on the floor with a clang. Through the hole, Cassandra could see the sky, bright and blue, and framed in the opening was the woman's face, looking down at her with those terrible black eyes. "Let me in," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "I've been waiting so long. Let me in so we can be together." Cassandra screamed, grabbed the bear spray, and emptied the entire canister up through the hole. The woman didn't react to the caustic spray, didn't flinch or move, just kept staring down with that vacant expression. Cassandra dropped the empty canister and ran to the windows, looking for escape. The platform outside was her only option, even though it was 80 feet to the ground and the stairs led down right past where the woman had first approached. She threw open the trap door, shoved the desk aside, and climbed out onto the platform, slamming the door behind her. The woman was no longer on the roof. Cassandra couldn't see her anywhere, and that was somehow worse than knowing where she was. She started down the stairs, taking them as fast as she dared, the metal steps ringing under her boots. She was halfway down when she realized the forest around the tower had changed. The trees were different species, types that didn't grow in this region. Tropical palms mixed with Arctic conifers, deciduous oaks alongside bamboo. A jumbled impossibility. The sky had darkened despite it being mid-morning, taking on a purple hue that hurt to look at directly. And standing in a circle around the base of the tower were dozens of people, all ages and genders, all wearing clothes from different eras, all with the same black eyes, all staring up at her with blank expressions. Cassandra stopped on the stairs, trapped between the cabin above and the crowd below. The woman's voice came from directly behind her, though when Cassandra spun around, no one was there. "You called to us. Every night when you broadcast your position, when you shine your lights into the darkness, you call to us. We've been waiting for someone to open the door to invite us in. And now we're here. Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you for letting us through." The tower began to vibrate, the metal groaning, and Cassandra realized it was tilting, leaning toward the forest as if the ground beneath its foundation was giving way. She grabbed the railing, holding on as the tilt increased, the tower swaying, the people below moving closer, reaching up toward her with hands that had too many fingers, mouths opening to reveal teeth that were all sharp incisors. The tower lurched, and Cassandra lost her grip, felt herself falling, the ground rushing up to meet her. She woke on the platform outside the cabin, the sun bright overhead, the heat intense. She was lying in a position that suggested she'd collapsed, perhaps passed out. She sat up slowly, her head pounding, her mouth dry. The tower was upright, stable, no sign of damage. The forest around her was normal, the correct species of trees, the sky its proper blue. She climbed back into the cabin and found it undamaged, the ceiling intact, no hole, the desk in its normal position. The radio was squawking, the dispatcher calling her name repeatedly, asking for status update. Cassandra grabbed the mic. "Tower 14 here. I'm okay. False alarm. I think I fell asleep and had a nightmare. Everything's fine." There was a pause before the dispatcher responded, and Cassandra could hear the skepticism in his voice. "Tower 14, you sounded pretty panicked earlier. Are you sure you're all right? We can send a helicopter to bring you out if you need relief." Cassandra almost said yes, almost accepted the offer to escape this place, but something stopped her. If she left now, if she ran, she'd never know what had happened, whether it was real or hallucination, whether she was losing her mind or experiencing something genuinely paranormal. "I'm fine," she repeated. "It was just a bad dream that felt very real. I'm good to continue my rotation." She signed off before the dispatcher could argue. She spent the rest of that day in a daze, going through her routine mechanically while trying to process what she'd experienced. As evening approached and sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red, she realized that she couldn't remember the middle part of the day. The hours between when she supposedly woke up on the platform and when she called the dispatcher. There was a gap, several hours that were just blank in her memory. That night, she forced herself to go through her normal routine, to act as if nothing unusual had happened. She went to bed at her regular time, leaving the lamp on low. She didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion pulled her under almost immediately. She dreamed of the people with black eyes standing in their circle around the tower, and in the dream she understood that they'd always been there, waiting, and that the tower was never a lookout for spotting fires. It was a beacon, a lighthouse in the darkness calling to things that lived in the spaces between worlds, inviting them to cross over into this reality. Every night when she turned on her lights, every time she broadcast her position via radio, she was strengthening the connection, making it easier for them to manifest. She woke before dawn, the understanding from the dream still vivid in her mind. She looked out the windows at the forest below, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom, and saw them. Dozens of figures standing among the trees, motionless, watching the tower. They were always there, she realized. She'd just never looked at the right time, never been aware enough to see them. They were patient, had been patient for years or decades or longer, waiting for the door to open fully, for the barrier to thin enough that they could cross over completely. Cassandra picked up the radio mic and called the district office, told them she was feeling ill and needed evacuation as soon as possible. The helicopter arrived 6 hours later, and she left Tower 14 with only the belongings she could carry, abandoning everything else. The pilot asked if she was okay, said she looked like she'd seen a ghost, and Cassandra laughed, the sound edging toward hysteria. When they were airborne, climbing away from the tower, she looked back and saw figures emerging from the forest, dozens of them converging on the tower, climbing its structure, disappearing into the cabin. The pilot didn't see them, or if he did, he didn't mention it. She quit the Forest Service 2 weeks later, moved to Vancouver, took a job in a coffee shop, surrounded herself with people and noise and light. She doesn't go into the wilderness anymore, can't stand the isolation, the silence, the darkness of places far from human habitation. And she knows that somewhere in the Caribou Mountains, Tower 14 still stands, its windows glowing at night, its radio broadcasting automated weather updates, and things with black eyes inhabit it, using it as their beacon, calling to other lost souls who might wander close enough to hear, inviting them to look up, to climb, to enter. She knows because sometimes late at night her radio picks up strange signals, voices speaking in languages she doesn't recognize, and underneath them all she hears her own voice echoing from months ago, calling out her location, reporting in, maintaining her vigil, forever trapped in that tower between worlds. Story 5. The Mine. Robert Duchesne was a mining safety inspector, 49 years old, with 26 years of experience evaluating underground operations across Ontario and Quebec. He'd descended into countless mines, walked through miles of tunnels carved from living rock, always alert for the hazards that made mining one of the most dangerous professions in existence. Unstable rock faces, inadequate ventilation, methane pockets, equipment failures, and the ever-present risk of collapse. He approached each inspection with meticulous attention to detail, his thorough reports often frustrating mine operators who viewed safety regulations as obstacles to productivity. But Robert had seen the aftermath of disasters caused by negligence, and he took his responsibility seriously. His wife Marie often said he cared more about strangers who worked underground than he did about his own safety, and she wasn't entirely wrong. On November 3, 2019, Robert was assigned to inspect the Beaumont Silver Mine, a small operation in northern Quebec about 150 kilometers from Val-d'Or. The mine had been in operation since 1978, producing modest quantities of silver and trace amounts of gold from a network of tunnels that descended over 800 meters below the surface. Recent complaints from workers about unusual sounds and unsafe conditions had prompted a comprehensive inspection. which Robert would conduct over 3 days, examining structural integrity, ventilation systems, emergency equipment, and overall compliance with provincial mining regulations. He arrived at the site mid-morning, met with the mine supervisor Francois Benoit, and was issued his equipment. Hard hat with attached lamp, emergency oxygen supply, radio, and the standard safety gear. The mine entrance was a concrete portal set into the side of a low hill, with rail tracks running into the darkness for the ore cars that ferried material to the surface. Francois explained that the main shaft descended at a 15-degree angle for approximately 400 meters before reaching the first level where the primary excavation occurred. Additional levels existed below that, reaching down to the 800-meter depth, though only the upper levels were currently active, the lower ones having been closed when the most accessible ore deposits were exhausted. "We don't go below level 3 anymore," Francois said. "Been sealed off for about 7 years now, but the workers have been reporting strange things from level 2, echoes and vibrations that don't match normal mining activity." Robert and Francois descended via the main shaft using an electric cart that ran on rails. The walls of the tunnel pressing close on either side, support beams every few meters, cables and pipes running along the ceiling carrying power and ventilation. The temperature increased as they descended, the rock holding the Earth's heat, and Robert checked his instruments, noting temperature and humidity, assessing the airflow. They reached level 1 without incident, where a crew of 6 miners were working, drilling and placing charges for the next blast. Robert conducted preliminary interviews asking about the reported issues and got varying responses. Some workers dismissed the concerns as nothing more than the normal sounds of an active mine, rock settling, equipment operating on other levels, the kind of noises you learn to ignore. Others looked uncomfortable, mentioned hearing sounds like voices speaking in the deeper tunnels, felt vibrations that didn't correspond to any scheduled blasting. Robert and Francois continued down to level 2, descending another 150 meters through a secondary tunnel that was narrower and less well lit than the main shaft. The air felt heavier here, despite the ventilation fans Robert could hear humming in the distance. Level 2 was largely inactive, the ore deposits mostly depleted, but the tunnels remained open for access to the ventilation equipment and as potential emergency routes. Francois led Robert through the main gallery, their helmet lamps cutting through darkness that felt strangely thick, as if the light had to work harder to penetrate. "This is where the reports have been concentrated," Francois said, gesturing down a side tunnel that branched off from the main gallery. "That tunnel leads to the old level 3 access shaft. It's been sealed with a concrete barrier, but workers claim they hear sounds coming from beyond it." Robert approached the side tunnel, noting immediately that the temperature dropped as he entered. Cool air flowing from somewhere ahead despite the sealed nature of the passage. His breath misted slightly in the beam of his headlamp. The tunnel extended about 60 meters before ending in a concrete wall, rough-poured and solid, completely blocking the passage. Robert examined it, checking for cracks or signs of deterioration that might allow air or sound to pass through, but found nothing. The barrier was intact and properly installed. He pressed his ear against the concrete, listening, and heard nothing except the faint hum of his own blood pulsing. Then, as he was about to turn away, he felt a vibration through the concrete, subtle but distinct. A rhythmic pulse like machinery operating or someone striking metal with regular intervals. Francois felt it too. Robert saw his expression change. "That's what the workers have been reporting," Francois said. "But there's nothing beyond this barrier except the sealed lower levels. No equipment, no activity. Those areas have been abandoned for years." Robert pulled out his radio and called to the surface, asking if any work was scheduled that might cause vibrations, any blasting or heavy machinery operation. The surface supervisor confirmed that nothing was scheduled. All crews were either on break or working in level 1, nowhere near this location. The vibration continued steady and persistent, and Robert realized he could now hear something beyond it. A faint sound that might have been voices, multiple people speaking in rhythm, though he couldn't make out any words. Francois had gone pale. "We should go back up," he said. "This area is safe to seal off. There's no reason to investigate further." But Robert's professional instincts overrode his growing unease. If there was any possibility that workers were trapped below or that some kind of structural issue was causing the sounds, he needed to investigate. "The barrier can be breached," he said. "We have equipment on site. I want to see what's on the other side." Francois argued, said it was unnecessary, potentially dangerous, but Robert was insistent. They returned to the surface, and Robert filed a formal request to open the sealed barrier, citing safety concerns and his authority as an inspector. The mine owner, contacted by phone, reluctantly approved, more afraid of regulatory penalties than whatever might be beyond the concrete wall. It took 3 hours to bring down a jackhammer and generator, and another hour to break through the barrier. Robert and Francois, along with 2 volunteer miners named Pierre and Alexandre, stood back as the concrete crumbled, revealing the tunnel beyond. Cool air rushed out, carrying a smell that Robert couldn't quite identify. Something organic and wrong, like meat that had begun to spoil. They waited for the dust to settle, then directed their lamps into the opening. The tunnel continued downward at a steep angle, the walls rough-hewn and less finished than the upper levels, support beams spaced further apart. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air had a moisture content higher than normal for this depth. Robert led the way, his equipment detecting adequate oxygen levels and no dangerous gases. The tunnel descended for about 80 meters before opening into a larger chamber, a natural cavern that the original miners had discovered and expanded, its dimensions extending beyond the reach of their headlamps. Francois stopped at the entrance to the cavern. "This wasn't on any of the mine plans I reviewed," he said. "I didn't know this existed." The cavern floor was relatively flat, covered in a thin layer of water that reflected their lights. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, and along the far wall, barely visible in the gloom, were the remains of mining equipment. Old rail tracks, a collapsed ore cart, tools rusted into unrecognizable shapes. As they moved into the cavern, Robert's light caught something that made him stop. There were marks on the walls carved into the rock, symbols that were definitely not natural formations, and didn't match any mining notation he'd ever seen. They were geometric patterns, circles and triangles arranged in complex configurations, and interspersed among them were what looked like stick figures, dozens of them carved in various poses. Some appeared to be falling, others standing in groups, still others in positions that suggested violence or struggle. Francois crossed himself, muttering something in French that Robert didn't catch. The vibration Robert had felt at the barrier was stronger here, emanating from somewhere deeper in the cavern. He followed it, the water on the floor splashing under his boots, and his light found an opening on the far side of the chamber, a natural fissure in the rock that descended into deeper darkness. The sound of voices was clearer now, definitely human voices speaking in unison, chanting something repetitive, though the words remained indistinct. Pierre and Alexandre refused to go further, said they would wait at the cavern entrance, and Francois looked like he wanted to join them, but he followed Robert to the fissure. The opening was narrow, requiring them to turn sideways to squeeze through, and it descended steeply, more of a natural chimney than a tunnel. Robert had to climb down, finding handholds on the rock face, his equipment making the descent awkward. The chanting grew louder as he descended, and with it came a smell that made his stomach turn, that same wrong organic odor but intensified, mixed with something metallic like blood. He reached the bottom of the chimney and found himself in another chamber, smaller than the first, and what he saw there made him freeze. The chamber walls were covered in more of those carved symbols, but these were more elaborate, more disturbing, the stick figures showing explicit scenes of violence and ritual. And in the center of the chamber, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 bodies. They were miners based on their clothing, wearing old-style gear that dated back decades. They sat upright, facing inward, their hands linked, their heads tilted back, and their mouths open as if singing or screaming. The bodies were mummified, preserved by the cool, dry air of the chamber, their skin leather-like and drawn tight over bone, their empty eye sockets dark pits. The chanting Robert had been hearing stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by his own harsh breathing and the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Francois climbed down behind him, saw the bodies, and made a sound of horror. "Mon Dieu, what is this? What happened here?" Robert approached the circle carefully, his every instinct screaming at him to leave, to get out of this chamber and this mine and never come back. But his professional training overrode instinct. These men had died down here, and he needed to understand how and why. He examined the bodies without touching them, noted that they showed no obvious signs of trauma, no wounds or broken bones visible through the clothing. They'd simply died sitting in this circle, perhaps from lack of oxygen or exposure. Though why they would have been down here in the first place was inexplicable. Then Robert noticed something that made his skin crawl. The bodies' mouths were moving, just slightly, a millimeter at a time, the leather-like lips pulling back from yellow teeth, the jaw hinges creaking. The chanting began again, and it was coming from the corpses themselves, from throats that should have been desiccated and incapable of producing sound. Robert stumbled backward, collided with Francois, and they both scrambled for the chimney, climbing up with desperate speed, hands slipping on rock, equipment banging against stone. They hauled themselves out into the larger cavern where Pierre and Alexandra were waiting with expressions of alarm. "We heard voices," Pierre said. "We heard—" "Run!" Robert interrupted. "Everyone out now!" They didn't need to be told twice, the 4 of them racing back through the cavern, through the descending tunnel, through the breached barrier and into Level 2's main gallery. They didn't stop until they reached Level 1, where the other miners were taking a break, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee from thermoses. Robert tried to explain what they'd found, but the words sounded insane even to his own ears. A hidden cavern, carved symbols, mummified miners arranged in a circle and somehow still chanting despite being dead for decades. The Level 1 supervisor, a man named Dennis, listened with increasing skepticism, then contacted the mine owner to report the situation. An emergency meeting was convened, and Robert insisted that the entire mine needed to be evacuated immediately while authorities were contacted. The mine owner, concerned about lost productivity and negative publicity, wanted to minimize the situation, suggested that Robert had misidentified what he'd seen, that the bodies were probably more recent than they appeared, perhaps miners who'd gotten lost in the abandoned sections and died of natural causes. Robert argued, showed his notes and photographs, demanded that proper authorities be brought in. The discussion continued for hours, and by the time a decision was reached to evacuate the mine and call the provincial police, it was early evening. As the miners gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, the power failed. The mine's lights went out, plunging everything into darkness except for the helmet lamps of the workers. Emergency lights should have engaged immediately, but they didn't. From somewhere deep below, from the direction of Level 3 and the cavern beyond, came a sound that made every person freeze. Voices, hundreds of them, chanting in unison. The sound echoing up through the shafts and tunnels, growing louder. Robert felt the vibration through his boots, through the rock itself, as if the entire mine was resonating with that terrible chorus. The miners ran for the surface, crowding onto the electric carts that still functioned on battery power, those who couldn't fit running up the main shaft on foot. Robert made sure everyone else got out first, counting heads, confirming that all personnel were accounted for, then climbed onto the last cart as it began its journey upward. The chanting followed them, growing louder instead of fading, and Robert could now make out words in the chant. Though they were in a language he didn't recognize, syllables that hurt his throat just to hear. They emerged into the night air, the mine entrance spilling out workers who stumbled and fell on the gravel, gasping for breath, some crying, others silent with shock. The mine supervisor did a final head count. Everyone was accounted for. From the entrance, the chanting continued to pour out, echoing across the forest, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Robert stood with the others, staring at the black opening of the mine, and watched as the entrance began to collapse. No explosives had been set, no structural failure should have occurred, but the portal folded in on itself as if crushed by an invisible hand, tons of rock and concrete crashing down, sealing the entrance completely in a matter of seconds. The mine's owner arrived within the hour, furious at the destruction of his property, demanding explanations. Provincial police arrived shortly after, along with mine rescue teams. Robert gave his statement, told them about the hidden cavern and the bodies and the impossible chanting, and saw the skepticism in their eyes. Francois corroborated his story, as did Pierre and Alexandre, but the other miners hadn't seen what was below, could only report the power failure and the sounds and the spontaneous collapse. It took 3 days to excavate the collapsed entrance enough to send a team inside. Robert was not part of that team, officially banned from the site by the mine owner, who blamed him for the entire incident. The rescue team descended to level 1, then level 2, then found the breached barrier. They entered the tunnel beyond and reached the large cavern, finding it exactly as Robert had described. The water on the floor, the carved symbols on the walls, the ancient equipment. But the fissure that led to the smaller chamber below was gone. The rock face was solid, no opening visible, as if it had never existed. No bodies were found, no evidence of the 7 mummified miners arranged in their circle. The official report concluded that Robert had experienced hallucinations due to oxygen deprivation, despite his equipment showing normal oxygen levels throughout the inspection. The carved symbols on the walls were attributed to previous miners, though no records existed of when or why they'd been made. The spontaneous collapse was blamed on structural weaknesses caused by Robert's team breaching the barrier. Robert was suspended from his position pending review, later quietly dismissed for violations of protocol and safety procedures. The Beaumont silver mine never reopened, the cost of repairs and the negative publicity making it economically unviable, and the site was eventually sold to a logging company that used the property for timber storage. Robert never worked as a mine inspector again. He took a job as a safety trainer, teaching courses to workers at surface facilities, anything that didn't require going underground. He told his story to anyone who would listen in the early days, but learned quickly that no one wanted to hear it, that people needed to believe that the world underground was simply rock and ore and empty space, not a place where reality became malleable and the dead could speak. He stopped talking about it eventually, but he never forgot. He knows that somewhere beneath the sealed mine entrance, in chambers that exist outside the normal geometry of the mine's plans, those 7 miners still sit in their circle. He knows that the chanting never really stopped, that it continues in frequencies beyond human hearing, resonating through the rock, calling to anyone who might descend deep enough to hear. He knows this because sometimes, late at night, when the house is silent and Marie is asleep beside him, he hears it faintly. That rhythmic chant in an unknown language, coming from somewhere deep beneath his feet, coming from everywhere and nowhere, a reminder that there are places in the earth where humans were never meant to go, and that once you've heard the voice of the deep places, they never fully release you. He sometimes wakes from dreams of descending into darkness, of finding more caverns with more circles of bodies, of adding himself to their number, sitting and linking hands and opening his mouth to join the eternal chant. And he knows that one day those dreams might not end with waking, that the pull of the depths grows stronger over time, and that eventually everyone who hears the chanting has to answer it, has to return to the source, has to descend one final time into the waiting darkness below. Story 6. The Aurora. Dr. Elena Volkov was an atmospheric physicist specializing in auroral research, 43 years old, with a PhD from the University of Toronto and 15 years of experience studying the interactions between solar wind and Earth's magnetosphere. She'd spent countless nights observing the northern lights from research stations across Canada's Arctic, collecting data on electromagnetic fluctuations, photographing auroral structures, and building models to predict their behavior and intensity. She found the aurora endlessly fascinating, these shimmering curtains of light produced by charged particles colliding with atmospheric gases. Nature's most beautiful demonstration of plasma physics in action. Her wife, Samantha, often joked that Elena loved the aurora more than she loved people, and Elena always laughed and changed the subject because there was uncomfortable truth in the joke. On December 21, 2017, Elena was stationed at the Eureka Weather Station on Ellesmere Island, one of the northernmost permanently inhabited locations on Earth. The station, situated at 80 degrees north latitude, was staffed year-round by a rotating crew of 8 scientists and support personnel, conducting research in meteorology, atmospheric chemistry, and space weather. December brought total polar night, 24 hours of darkness that would last until February, creating ideal conditions for auroral observation without interference from sunlight. Elena had arrived 3 weeks earlier, brought in by Twin Otter aircraft, and was scheduled to remain for a 2-month rotation collecting data during the darkest period. The solar forecast for December 21st predicted intense geomagnetic activity, a coronal mass ejection having erupted from the sun 4 days earlier, sending a wave of charged particles racing toward Earth at speeds exceeding 2 million kilometers per hour. When those particles arrived and interacted with the magnetosphere, they would create one of the strongest auroral displays of the year. Elena spent the day checking her equipment, magnetometers, all sky cameras, spectrographs, and the array of instruments that would automatically record data throughout the event. The other station personnel were excited. Even those who'd seen many auroras before knew that nights like this were special, when the entire sky would fill with dancing light in colors ranging from green to red to rare blue and purple. The aurora began at 9:47 p.m., appearing first as a faint green glow on the northern horizon, then intensifying and spreading, curtains of light unfurling across the sky like cosmic banners. Elena stood outside in the -45-degree cold, her face protected by a balaclava, her camera clicking automatically on its tripod, and watched with the awe that never diminished no matter how many times she witnessed the phenomenon. The lights swirled and pulsed, forming patterns that seemed almost intentional, spirals and waves and arcs that stretched from horizon to horizon. The colors intensified, brilliant green dominating but punctuated by strokes of red and purple, the entire sky alive with luminescence. At 11:23 p.m., Elena noticed something unusual. The aurora's movement, typically fluid and organic, had become more structured, more geometric. The lights were forming shapes that held their configuration for several seconds before dissolving and reforming into new patterns. She watched through her camera's viewfinder, zooming in on one particularly striking formation, a perfect circle of light with rays extending from its center like spokes of a wheel, rotating slowly clockwise. The pattern held for nearly 20 seconds, far longer than normal auroral structures maintained coherence before fragmenting into the usual flowing curtains. She checked her magnetometer data on her laptop, looking for anomalies in the magnetic field that might explain the unusual structure. The readings were erratic, fluctuating wildly outside normal parameters, showing variations that shouldn't be possible from solar-wind interaction alone. She called to Marcus Chen, the station's meteorologist, who was observing from a nearby position. "Marcus, are you seeing this? The patterns?" He approached, looked up at the sky where the aurora was now forming what appeared to be concentric circles. Multiple rings nested inside each other, pulsing in sequence from outer to inner. "That's not normal," he said, stating the obvious. More of the station personnel came outside, drawn by the spectacular display, and they stood in a loose group watching the sky put on a show that defied their understanding. The aurora was now creating shapes that were unmistakably artificial in their precision. Triangles, squares, even what looked like letters or symbols flashing into existence and disappearing. Elena felt her scientific certainty wavering, replaced by something she wasn't accustomed to feeling: unease. The aurora was a natural phenomenon. She'd spent her entire career studying it, and there was no mechanism by which it could produce deliberately structured patterns. Yet that's what she was witnessing. At 11:52 p.m., the aurora began to descend. Instead of remaining at its normal altitude of 100 to 300 kilometers above the surface, the lights came down, dropping lower in the sky, the curtains appearing closer, more substantial. Elena checked her all-sky cameras, watched the footage in real time, and saw that the lights were definitely descending, the angles and perspective changing in ways that indicated decreasing altitude. "That's impossible," she muttered. "The auroral oval doesn't work that way. The lights can't descend below the ionosphere." But they were descending, and as they came lower, Elena could hear something. It started as a faint crackling, like distant radio static, then grew louder, resolving into a sound that was almost musical, high-pitched notes that seemed to harmonize with each other, creating chords and melodies. Other people heard it too, looking around confused, trying to identify the source. The sound was coming from the aurora itself, from the lights in the sky, which was scientifically impossible. Auroras were completely silent. The atmospheric interactions that created the light occurred at altitudes where the air was too thin to transmit sound waves to the ground. Yet the sound was undeniable, growing louder, the crackling and musical notes mixing into something that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The lights descended to what Elena estimated was less than a kilometer altitude, so close that she could see individual structures within them, filaments and streamers that moved with purpose rather than random currents. The colors had intensified beyond anything she'd seen before, the green so bright it cast visible shadows, the red pulsing like arterial blood. And within the lights, Elena began to see shapes. They were humanoid but wrong, tall and thin with elongated limbs moving through the aurora as if it were a medium they could swim through. She counted at least 20 of them spread across the sky, descending with the lights. Marcus grabbed her arm. "Elena, are you seeing that? Tell me you're seeing that." She nodded, unable to speak, her scientific mind screaming that this couldn't be real, that she was hallucinating or experiencing some kind of oxygen deprivation or equipment malfunction. But all 8 station personnel were seeing the same thing, pointing at the shapes in the lights, backing away toward the station building with instinctive fear. The shapes were coming down with the aurora, and they were becoming more solid, more real, as if they were crossing over from some other realm into physical reality. The aurora touched the ground about 50 meters from the station, the lights pooling on the snow like liquid, spreading outward, and from them emerged the figures Elena had seen descending. They were tall, 3 meters at least, with bodies that seemed to be composed of the light itself, translucent and shimmering, but with enough solidity to cast shadows and leave footprints in the snow. Their faces were featureless, smooth ovals without eyes or mouths, and they moved with fluid grace that was hypnotic to watch. There were now dozens of them emerging from the aurora, standing on the Arctic ice, and they were all facing the station building where the humans had gathered. Elena's scientific training warred with primal terror. Part of her wanted to approach, to attempt communication, to study these impossible beings, to understand what they were and where they came from. But the deeper, older part of her brain was screaming to run, to hide, to get away from these things that should not exist. The figures began walking toward the station, moving in perfect synchronization, their footsteps silent despite leaving tracks. The station personnel retreated inside, sealing the doors, gathering in the common room with windows that looked out over the compound. The figures surrounded the building, standing in a perfect circle, motionless, their featureless faces directed at the windows. Elena counted 43 of them, more still emerging from the aurora that had pooled on the ground like spilled paint. The sound they'd been producing changed, the musical notes becoming words, or something like words, syllables in a language Elena didn't recognize but that resonated in her bones, vibrating through the building structure. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't traveling through air but through some other medium, directly into her mind. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the station director, tried the radio, attempting to contact the main research base at Eureka or the military station at Alert 210 kilometers east, but got nothing except static and underneath it, more of that alien language. The satellite phone produced the same result, the connection establishing but carrying only that voice speaking in rhythmic cadences that might have been poetry or ritual or commands. Elena approached one of the windows, looking out at the nearest figure, and it turned toward her as if sensing her attention. For a moment, they stood facing each other through the glass, separated by a barrier that suddenly felt very thin. The figure raised one of its long arms and touched the window. The glass frosted instantly, ice crystals spreading from the point of contact in fractal patterns. And through the ice, Elena saw something that made her mind reel. The figure was showing her images, projecting them directly into her consciousness. She saw Earth from space, saw the aurora from above as it appeared during geomagnetic storms, saw other worlds orbiting other stars with their own auroral displays, and saw these figures emerging from those lights on those distant worlds. She understood in that moment that they weren't creatures from another dimension or supernatural entities. They were travelers using auroras as pathways between worlds, riding the magnetic field lines that connected all stars and all planets, and they'd been doing this since before humans existed. The images continued. She saw Earth's ancient past, saw these beings emerging from auroras witnessed by primitive humans who interpreted them as gods or spirits or demons, saw them studying civilizations that rose and fell, always watching, always using the lights as their doorway. She saw the future or possible futures, timelines branching and diverging, some where humanity thrived and reached the stars, others where humanity destroyed itself or was destroyed by forces beyond its control. And she saw that the figures were not hostile or helpful. They were simply observers, travelers passing through, drawn by consciousness and electromagnetic phenomena, curious about life but fundamentally alien, operating according to motivations humans couldn't comprehend. The vision ended, and Elena stumbled back from the window, her nose bleeding, her head pounding with migraine intensity. The figure remained pressed against the glass, and Elena realized that all the figures surrounding the building were doing the same, touching the walls, the windows, the doors, making contact. The building's temperature was dropping rapidly despite the heating system running at full capacity, frost forming on interior surfaces, the air crystallizing with moisture. The lights flickered, power fluctuating, and Elena understood that the figure's presence was disrupting the station's systems, their electromagnetic nature interfering with anything electronic. Marcus was shouting something, but Elena couldn't focus on his words, still processing the images she'd been shown, trying to integrate them into her understanding of reality. The other personnel were panicking, some trying to barricade doors, others attempting to gather supplies, everyone operating on instinct without clear plan. The figures continued their contact with the building, and the structure began to resonate, vibrating at a frequency that made breathing difficult, made hearts skip beats, made reality feel thin and insubstantial. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The figures withdrew from the building, stepped back in unison, and turned away, walking back toward the aurora pools on the ground. They merged with the lights, disappearing into the luminescence, and the aurora began to rise, ascending back into the sky, pulling away from the surface. Within minutes, the lights had returned to their normal altitude, and the strange geometric patterns had dissolved back into flowing curtains. By midnight, the aurora had faded entirely, the sky returning to its normal state of darkness punctuated by stars. The station personnel emerged cautiously, checking the exterior of the building for damage. The only evidence of what had occurred were the footprints in the snow, hundreds of them surrounding the building in perfect circles. Elena photographed them, measured them, collected samples of the snow that had been compressed by impossible weight. The equipment inside showed signs of electromagnetic disruption, several instruments fried beyond repair, data corrupted or erased. But there was no physical damage, no structural issues, the building intact and functional despite the terror of the past hours. Elena spent the rest of the night compiling her data, reviewing camera footage, analyzing magnetometer readings, trying to document what had happened with scientific rigor. The footage showed everything: the aurora descending, the figures emerging, their interaction with the building. The magnetometer data showed electromagnetic variations that violated known physics, fields that fluctuated in patterns that suggested intelligence or purpose rather than natural phenomena. When dawn finally came, thin and gray after the long hours of darkness, Elena submitted a preliminary report to her superiors at the university. The response was immediate and discouraging. Her report was rejected, deemed unscientific, attributed to equipment malfunction and mass hallucination caused by isolation stress. The camera footage was analyzed and dismissed as artifacts of overexposure and lens flare. The magnetometer data was explained as errors caused by electromagnetic interference from the station's own equipment. Her superiors suggested that Elena take immediate leave, that she return to Toronto for psychological evaluation, that she reconsider whether polar research was appropriate for her mental health. The other 7 station personnel were interviewed separately, and each was pressured to recant their statements, to admit they'd been confused or influenced by suggestion, until eventually all but Elena agreed that perhaps they'd misinterpreted what they'd seen, that the auroral display had been unusual but not impossible, that no figures had emerged, that the whole event was a combination of natural phenomena and overwrought imaginations. Elena refused to recant. She insisted that what she'd witnessed was real, that the data supported her observations, that dismissing it was intellectual cowardice. As a result, her research grant was revoked, her position at the university was terminated, and she was blacklisted from the auroral research community. She fought the decisions for a year, appealing to scientific ethics committees, trying to publish her findings in peer-reviewed journals. But every door closed in her face. The scientific establishment had decided that her claims were too extraordinary, too disruptive to accepted models, and rather than investigate seriously, they chose to silence her. Elena eventually stopped fighting, worn down by the institutional resistance, and took a job teaching high school physics in Iqaluit. She no longer conducts research, no longer observes the aurora professionally, but she watches it every night that conditions allow, standing outside in the Arctic cold, looking up at the lights and remembering. She knows that the figures are still there, still traveling between worlds, using the magnetic field lines as highways, still emerging from the aurora to observe and study and then depart. She knows that every culture in the far north has stories about beings in the lights, spirits and gods and things without names. And she understands now that those stories are memories, accounts passed down through generations of genuine encounters with the travelers. Sometimes, on nights when the aurora is particularly intense, Elena sees shapes in the lights, humanoid figures moving through the curtains of green and red. And she wonders if they remember her, if they recognize the human who looked into their alien consciousness and survived. She wonders what they're looking for, what drives them to visit world after world, what observations they're recording in whatever way they process information. She wonders if humanity will ever develop the technology to follow them, to ride the magnetic highways between stars, to become travelers ourselves. And she knows that if that day comes, if humans ever emerge from Earth's aurora onto alien worlds, there will be civilizations waiting below who will watch with fear and wonder. And their scientists will later claim they saw nothing, that the lights were merely beautiful and natural and completely ordinary, because accepting the truth would require changing everything they thought they knew about the universe. But Elena knows the truth, and she carries it with her through every dark Arctic night, a secret that isolates her from her peers but connects her to something vast and ancient and forever beyond human understanding. A mystery written in light across the magnetic skies of countless worlds. Story 7. The Experiment. Dr. Marcus Thorne was a neuroscientist specializing in consciousness research, 36 years old with degrees from McGill University and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Montreal Neurological Institute. His work focused on the neural correlates of subjective experience, attempting to identify which brain structures and patterns of activity corresponded to conscious awareness versus unconscious processing. It was cutting-edge research that existed at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology, asking fundamental questions about the nature of mind and the relationship between physical brain and subjective experience. Marcus approached these questions with rigorous methodology and healthy skepticism toward unfalsifiable claims about consciousness. But he remained open to wherever the data led, even into uncomfortable territory that challenged materialist assumptions. In October 2016, Marcus received funding from a private foundation to conduct a unique experiment using sensory deprivation and neural imaging to study altered states of consciousness. The experiment, conducted at a facility in rural Manitoba, would involve placing participants in specialized isolation tanks filled with salt water maintained at skin temperature, creating an environment with minimal sensory input. While isolated, participants would wear EEG caps that wirelessly transmitted brain activity data to external monitors. The goal was to observe how the brain behaved when deprived of normal sensory stimulation, whether new patterns of neural activity emerged, and what subjective experiences participants reported during extended isolation. The experiment had been approved by ethics committees and would use trained volunteers who'd been thoroughly screened and briefed on potential psychological effects. The facility was a converted farmhouse about 40 kilometers outside Winnipeg, chosen for its isolation and minimal electromagnetic interference that could disrupt sensitive recording equipment. Marcus arrived on October 7th with his research assistant, Jennifer Liu, and spent 2 days setting up the equipment and preparing the isolation tanks, 3 of them installed in separate soundproofed rooms in the building's basement. Each tank was rectangular, approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, filled with 800 liters of water supersaturated with Epsom salt to create buoyancy that eliminated gravitational pressure on the body. The tanks could be sealed with heavy lids that blocked all light, creating absolute darkness, and the rooms themselves were acoustically treated to eliminate external sounds. The first group of 3 participants arrived on October 9th. Sarah Beaumont, a meditation instructor experienced with altered states, David Kowalski, a graduate student in psychology, and Michelle Tremblay, a writer researching consciousness for a book. Marcus conducted final briefings, explained the protocols, and emphasized that participants could terminate their session at any time by simply opening the tank lid and exiting. The target duration was 4 hours, longer than typical commercial float sessions, but within safe parameters established by previous research. Each participant would be monitored continuously via EEG and intercom systems, with Jennifer watching the data feeds while Marcus remained available to respond to any issues. The session began at 7 p.m. The participants entered their respective tanks, settled into the water, and sealed the lids, plunging themselves into darkness and silence. Marcus and Jennifer monitored from the control room, watching 3 computer screens showing real-time EEG data from each participant. Initially, the brain activity showed expected patterns. High beta waves indicating alertness and some anxiety about the unfamiliar environment. Gradually transitioning to alpha and theta waves as the participants relaxed and adjusted to the sensory deprivation. Sarah's brain activity was particularly interesting, showing experienced meditators' characteristic patterns. Sustained theta with bursts of gamma, that suggested focused awareness. At 8:23 p.m., 73 minutes into the session, all 3 EEG monitors simultaneously showed anomalous readings. The brain waves from all 3 participants synchronized, beginning to display identical patterns despite the participants being in separate rooms with no communication between them. Marcus leaned forward, studying the data. "That shouldn't be possible," he said. "They're not connected. There's no mechanism for their brain activity to synchronize like this." Jennifer checked the equipment, looking for technical malfunctions, but found nothing wrong. The signals were clear and strong, and they showed all 3 brains producing the same frequency and amplitude patterns, waveforms so similar they could be overlaid perfectly. The synchronized patterns shifted, the brain activity moving into a state Marcus had never seen in his research. All frequencies present simultaneously at high amplitude. Beta and alpha and theta and delta all occurring together, creating interference patterns that should have been functionally impossible. Jennifer activated the intercom to Sarah's tank. "Sarah, this is Jennifer. How are you feeling? Can you describe your current state?" Static answered her, thick and distorted, though the intercom had tested perfectly during setup. She tried David's intercom, then Michelle's, getting the same static response from both. "The intercoms are down," she said. "Should we terminate the session?" Marcus was torn between scientific curiosity and concern for participant safety. The EEG readings showed elevated brain activity, but nothing that indicated distress or danger. And the participants hadn't attempted to exit their tanks, which they would presumably do if they were uncomfortable. "Let's give it a few more minutes," he decided. "Monitor closely. If the patterns don't normalize or if we see any signs of distress, we terminate immediately." Jennifer nodded, though her expression showed doubt about the decision. At 8:41 p.m., the EEG monitors all displayed the same message simultaneously. "We are here." The text appeared overlaid on the brainwave data, rendered in blocky pixels, then disappeared, replaced by normal data displays. Marcus and Jennifer stared at the screens, then at each other. "Did you see that?" Marcus asked, needing confirmation that he hadn't imagined it. "The text on all 3 monitors?" Jennifer nodded, her face pale. That's not possible. The EEG software doesn't display text. There's no mechanism for that message to appear. Someone would have to hack the system to inject text into the feed. Marcus checked the computer's network connections, found them isolated as they should be. No internet or local network access that would allow remote intrusion. The system was standalone, running specialized software that had no text display functions, yet they'd both seen the message clear and explicit. Before they could process this impossibility, the message appeared again, this time staying on screen. We hear you. We answer. We come through. The monitors flickered, and new images began to appear between the waveform displays. Geometric patterns that rotated and evolved, shapes and dimensions that hurt to perceive, creating optical illusions of depth and movement that seemed to extend beyond the flat screens. Jennifer reached for the emergency shutdown switch that would illuminate the tank rooms and activate alarms to alert the participants to exit immediately. Marcus grabbed her wrist. Wait, document this, record everything, whatever's happening, we need data. Jennifer pulled away from his grip. This has gone beyond research, Marcus. Something is wrong, seriously wrong. We need to get them out now. But Marcus was transfixed by the monitors, by the impossible images and the brainwave patterns that suggested his participants were experiencing something unprecedented, possibly something that could revolutionize understanding of consciousness. The geometric patterns on the monitors resolved into something more representational. Marcus could see what looked like spaces, rooms, or corridors, but their architecture was wrong. Walls meeting at angles that shouldn't exist, dimensions folding in on themselves. And moving through those spaces were figures, humanoid but distorted, their proportions shifting as if seen through warped glass. The figures were approaching something that Marcus realized with horror was a barrier or membrane, and they were pushing against it, trying to break through. The EEG data showed the participants' brain activity spiking, all frequencies maxing out, creating patterns that exceeded the equipment's ability to display. Jennifer hit the emergency shutdown over Marcus's protests. Lights blazed in the tank rooms, alarms blared, but no movement came from the tanks. The lids remained closed, the participants still inside. Jennifer ran from the control room, Marcus following, and they descended to the basement to the 3 soundproofed rooms. Jennifer opened the door to Sarah's room and they found the tank sealed. She tried to lift the lid, but it wouldn't budge, as if held closed from inside with impossible strength. "Sarah!" Jennifer shouted, pounding on the tank. "Sarah, you need to exit now. Open the lid." No response came from inside the tank. Marcus and Jennifer moved to David's room, found the same situation. Tank sealed, lid immovable, no response to their calls. Michelle's room was identical. All 3 participants were locked inside their tanks, either unable or unwilling to respond to the emergency protocols. "We need to force the lids open," Jennifer said, looking around for tools. They found a crowbar in the facility's maintenance closet and returned to Sarah's room, wedging the bar under the lid's edge and applying leverage. The lid resisted, then suddenly gave way, flying open so violently that Marcus was thrown backward. The tank's interior was empty. The salt water remained, still sloshing from the sudden opening, but Sarah was gone. No body, no clothing, no EEG cap, nothing. Just water in a sealed tank that couldn't have been opened from inside without them seeing it. Jennifer made a sound between a gasp and a sob. They ran to David's room, forced his lid open with the same result. Empty tank. Water, but no participant. Michelle's tank was also empty. All 3 people had vanished from sealed containers in separate locked rooms while under continuous monitoring. Marcus's mind raced through impossible explanations. Elaborate hoax, hidden exits, coordinated deception. But the tanks had been thoroughly inspected. The rooms were simple concrete rectangles with no hidden spaces, and the participants had no motive to conspire in such a complex prank. Jennifer was calling the police on her cell phone, reporting 3 missing persons, her voice shaking. Marcus returned to the control room, needing to review the recordings to understand what the data showed. The computer monitors were now displaying normal EEG patterns, but the brainwave signals were still present, still transmitting wirelessly from the EEG caps that should have been with the missing participants. He isolated Sarah's signal and was horrified to realize that it showed brain activity, coherent patterns that indicated consciousness, but the signal's location data showed it coming from somewhere that wasn't the facility, wasn't even nearby. The triangulation system designed to locate the wireless caps within the building for equipment recovery purposes showed her signal originating from approximately 200 kilometers north, somewhere in the wilderness of the Canadian Shield. David's and Michelle's signals were similarly displaced, each coming from different distant locations, all far from the facility. The police arrived within 30 minutes, skeptical and concerned, taking statements from Marcus and Jennifer while search teams examined the facility. No evidence of foul play was found, no signs of struggle or forced entry, no physical explanation for how 3 people could disappear from locked rooms under observation. The investigation expanded. Search and rescue teams were dispatched to the wilderness locations indicated by the EEG signal triangulation, but found nothing except empty forest. The signals themselves continued for 6 hours after the disappearances before simultaneously ceasing at 2:47 a.m., all 3 cutting out at the same instant. Sarah, David, and Michelle were never found. No bodies, no clothing, no evidence of what had happened to them. Their families were devastated, demanding answers that Marcus couldn't provide. The police investigation focused on him as the primary suspect, suggesting elaborate murder despite the complete lack of physical evidence or plausible method. The case remained unsolved, eventually classified as missing persons, with Marcus as a person of interest, though never formally charged due to insufficient evidence. The experiment was condemned as reckless and dangerous. Marcus's funding was revoked. His research credentials were stripped, and he became unemployable in academic neuroscience. Jennifer broke under the pressure, was hospitalized for psychological trauma, and later recanted her testimony, claiming she'd been coerced by Marcus into lying about what they'd observed, that the messages on the monitors and the brainwave anomalies were fabricated data to cover up his crimes. Her reversal destroyed Marcus's credibility completely and reinforced the narrative that he'd somehow murdered the participants despite the impossibility of doing so without leaving evidence. He was ostracized from the scientific community, divorced by his wife who couldn't reconcile the man she knew with the accusations, and left to carry the weight of what had happened alone. Marcus knows the truth, knows that Sarah and David and Michelle weren't murdered but were somehow taken, pulled through some kind of barrier or membrane into somewhere else, carried along neural pathways that existed beyond physical space. He knows because he has the recordings, the raw EEG data and video footage that he saved before the police seized the equipment. And when he reviews it in the privacy of his small apartment in a bad neighborhood in Winnipeg, he sees what the monitors showed that night. The geometric patterns and the impossible spaces and the figures pushing through the membrane. He sees the exact moment when the brainwave signals moved, when the locations jumped from the facility to distant wilderness, as if consciousness itself had been transported instantaneously across space. He knows that human consciousness is not confined to the physical brain, that awareness can exist independent of body, and that there are entities or intelligences in those other spaces who heard his participants' minds broadcasting in the silence of sensory deprivation, and who reached back, who answered, who pulled them through into realms that humans weren't meant to access. He knows that sensory deprivation doesn't just quiet the mind, it opens doorways, removes the filters that normally constrain perception to physical reality, and allows consciousness to touch something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. And he knows that he opened those doorways with his experiment, that he's responsible for whatever happened to his participants, whether they're dead or alive or existing in some state that transcends those categories. Sometimes late at night, Marcus sets up a small sensory deprivation environment in his bathroom. Darkness, silence, floating in a tub of salt water with earplugs and eye mask. He does this despite knowing the danger, despite the terror of what might happen, because he needs to understand, needs to follow where his participants went, needs to make contact with whatever took them. He never achieves the depth of isolation that the tanks provided, never quite crosses the threshold, but he gets close enough to feel something waiting in the darkness, something aware of him, something that whispers without words directly into the substrate of his consciousness. It tells him things about the nature of reality, about the illusion of physical separation, about the network of minds that exists beneath and beyond material existence. A network that spans not just Earth, but extends to every world where consciousness has emerged, all connected in ways that humans are only beginning to glimpse. And it tells him that Sarah and David and Michelle are still there, still conscious, still existing in that network, unable to return to their physical bodies but not dead, transformed into something else, something that experiences reality in ways that would drive a materialist scientist to madness if fully comprehended. Marcus doesn't know if this is true or if the isolation is driving him insane. Doesn't know if the whispers are genuine contact with other intelligences or just his mind fragmenting under guilt and trauma. But he continues his sessions, continues reaching into the darkness, and he knows that one night he'll reach far enough, the connection will become strong enough, and he'll follow his participants through that membrane, leave his body behind and join them in the spaces between physical reality. He knows this is probably death, or worse than death, dissolution of individual identity into something collective and alien. But he also knows it's the only way to answer the questions his research raised, and Marcus has always been driven by the need to follow data wherever it leads, even into darkness, even into dissolution, even into the endless network of consciousness that humans have touched only in dreams and madness and the cold quiet of perfect isolation.